Brazil Central.
Brasil Central. Brasil Central.
The great problem is that over the last few years, driven by the fear of, used in politics, the government has introduced legislations or various bills that are absolutely contrary to our values and belief in multiculturalism. And the Shadow Minister, Tony Burke, specifically mentioned the citizenship changes, which are in their use of the English language test really draconian and bring us right back, as he suggests, right back to the White Australia policy in their effect. And there are many, many other examples. The discretionary power of the minister not subject to judicial control for practical purposes, to take away citizenship if you are a dual citizen, to cancel visas if you have committed even very minor offences, to embark upon counter-terrorism legislations that are quite disproportionate to a legitimate aim. We have control orders now for 14-year-olds. We have retention of metadata laws that breach privacy. We have all sorts of laws now that have been enacted, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, that are extreme and disproportionate laws that in many respects have a particular impact on the multicultural community. And the curiosity and the irony, if perhaps is the better word, from this is that it's the multicultural community that's in fact at least 50% of the Australian public. And if we want to push back against extreme ISIS propaganda, against terrorism, and the young men typically in the Australian community who might be turned towards antisocial behaviour of one kind or another, one of the things that we can best use to counter that fear and the conflation with terror of asylum seekers and refugees, for example, is to work more closely with communities for social cohesion. And I would see that, as the Minister says, this is a turning point. It is a turning point. We need much bigger budgets to educate and communicate with the Australian community. A mainstream media needs to reflect the diversity of our community, and we need programs which can support cohesion.
We know for a fact, we had a talk about the post-truth era, and we know for a fact that domestic violence is a far greater problem in Australia than terrorism, but we don't see all the people screaming, pulling their head out around domestic violence. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that in this particular time, government is putting these disproportionate measures attacking multiculturalism and not really having a look at the real issues that we have in Australia nowadays? Why, in your opinion, that happens?
Well, firstly, you're quite right. If we were to see the approximately a woman is killed every week in Australia by her partner or former partner. In addition to that, of course, children are traumatised and 25 children are killed in a domestic violence environment, broadly speaking, because the data varies depending on how you collect it from state to state. But that's the problem. Now, if that number of people, 70, 80, 100 people, were killed every year in a terrorist act, we would be putting billions of dollars into countering it. But in fact, that money goes to the rare example of a death from terrorism in Australia, to preventive measures, which of course are important. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be putting money into counter-terrorist activities, but we should be proportionate in the way in which we deal with this. And we are ignoring major social problems and problems broadly of social cohesion in favour of a politically fear-driven process of putting emphasis on border security and terrorism.
Do you think that one of the reasons would be that border security actually makes a lot of money for people who are interested in financing campaigns or maybe already financing campaigns in opposition for domestic violence that maybe, is not going to be putting money in constructions and weaponry and all that sort of thing? Do you think that could be?
I'm afraid that sort of conjures up the idea of the sort of corporate-driven political environment that we live in. But I'm fearful that there's a lot of truth in that. Some companies have made billions of dollars out of providing services to hold men, women and children in detention. enormous amounts of money going into weaponry and submarines and new fighter planes. We are not discussing these issues at a proportionate level. As I say, I'm not saying we shouldn't have those things, but I'm saying we are grossly disproportionate in not providing the programs that would support social cohesion. Why is this? It may be because of the strength of the corporate and business sector as lobbyists in government. And perhaps I can give you an example of this, which shocked me when I learned about it, and I believe it to be accurate. Of something like 550 registered lobbyists in Canberra, or Australia generally, and they have to be registered, about 270 of them have been elected members of Parliament in the past. So the connection between democratic representatives in Canberra or state, once they lose their positions, and many do, of course, and there's a constant and very high turnover of politicians, they then go, and a very high number of them, go into working for the banks, working for big corporate bodies, many of them providing services to asylum, to deal with counter-terrorism or guards and detention centres. A lot of money to be made, and I think this is a very troubling aspect of Australian democracy.
Exactly. This would be something that just came to my mind. So obviously, if you have that sort of professional lobbyists, previous parliamentarians, that puts in check the very idea of democracy, the government of the people, which is more like a plutocracy, you know.
It becomes that, and I'm afraid when you put it in corporate capitalist terms and the very close relationship between elected representatives and former elected representatives and the business corporate community, you do start to be very suspicious about why it is we're not protecting the most vulnerable in our community and why we take such grossly disproportionate approaches to issues like terrorism but ignore domestic violence. It's hard to search for reasons. One can only make educated guesses as to how this is happening. But I, the more I look into it, the more I see the role of corporate business environments supporting this disproportionate expenditure of funds. And I was particularly interested today that the Minister rather proudly announced $12 million for ethnic and multimedia broadcasting. In
a video recording, not in person.
In a video recording, didn't come, and it's here in Canberra, so it's not difficult. And that is a funding over 3 or 4 years, and that is a trivial, tiny sum of money relative to the billions that are being spent in other areas where I think arguably the funding is disproportionate. So I'm afraid it is a despairing environment, and I think the Minister Tony Burke makes a very good point in saying that this is a turning point. The multicultural Australia being about 50% of Australia, we have got to be more alert to what is actually happening here in Canberra. Most people are oblivious to these laws that are being passed, including this ABC Fair and Balanced Bill, which fortunately failed. But much of the other citizenship laws, counter-terrorism laws, cancellation of visas, metadata laws are all going forward with very little public engagement with the consequences, particularly again for multicultural communities.
And one last question, going back to the first one, why is multiculturalism good for Australia in your opinion?
Well, I would make the point, of course, as a human rights lawyer, that it's part of our opening and welcome arms that's helped create the sort of fair and equal society that Australia aspires to be. But one doesn't have to make the human rights or ethical argument. You can simply make a business case. If we've been talking about the role of business, we know there's a lot of research now that supports the fact that our refugee migrant community, whatever basis they've come into Australia, once they have stability, their children are in school, the parents can get out into the business community, they are actually, they bring enormous wealth to Australia. And for us to ignore that or pretend it's only a tiny percentage is simply inaccurate. There is enormous, there's a very significant business case to be made for our migration program, and I think we should honour it and recognise it and support it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.